We're in denial for a whole variety of reasons. I mean, it's a human tendency. We're habitual species. And even cognitive neurobiology tells us now that once we're used to thinking a certain way, once we've adopted a certain sort of beliefs, values, and assumptions, and once we've acquired an ideology or a religious belief set or even an academic paradigm, then we tend to be loyal to it. We seek out experiences that reinforce our pre-existing ideas, and we tend to deny, reject, or forget about anything that challenges those ideas. So we have a culture that is naturally habitual, that is comfortable in its current way of life, that is constantly having the notion that growth is necessary and that more material goods leads to happiness rammed down its throat by a multi-billion-dollar-a-year advertising industry. Why would we be surprised that people resist ideas that suggest all of this is driving the destruction of the planet, and that if we really want to survive as a civilization, we're going to have to change our ways dramatically? Very discomforting, very unsettling ideas, and hardly anyone is willing to open their minds to it. Well, I mean, this is a critical question, and because energy has been so abundant and cheap, as a culture we haven't thought it through. So if I take your words literally, what happens if you take away abundant cheap energy? Then this entire global edifice collapses. There's no question about that, because 90% of our food is now the product of fossil energy rather than solar energy and soil. Almost all of the resources that we need to maintain this high input, high throughput culture are acquired through the use of fossil fuel. All our mines, all our fisheries, all our forests, everything that we exploit is done through fossil fuels. And of course we need those resources to maintain the population and to maintain and continue to create the furniture and infrastructure of that civilization. Take the energy away and it just falls apart. So the question there is, can we even maintain the current capital stock of people and all of our goods without some functional substitute for fossil fuel? And the simple reality is we don't have one at the present time, and that's one of the reasons why we're seeing such a panic around declining oil supplies, rising food prices, and in fact rising prices for just about everything as fossil fuels start to become scarcer. If you think of a rocket ship going straight up, there's many things that keep it on course, from a complicated guidance system to the environment through which it's traveling. But if it doesn't have any fuel, it's not going anywhere. And the problem is that that rocket will continue to accelerate. It'll get faster and faster right up to the point where it runs absolutely out of fuel, and then it comes down. And so we have a problem right now in that we're accelerating, we're growing globally. We are in a situation where we haven't paid attention to the fuel gauge, and we're going to be surprised if we're caught short. I think it's fairly clear that within human society there are many things that go on at a cyclical level. I mean, even economists talk about the business cycle and so on and so forth. But if you think of the human cycle of civilizations, there are several books and many studies to show us that one of the commonest phenomena is that civilizations collapse. They grow through the early phases of the adaptive cycle, so-called, but often they don't recover. And I think they don't recover because of a singular unique quality of human beings, and that is that they so alter their environment, they so use up the resources that there's nothing left on the same site for a subsequent resurgence or recovery of that civilization. So for example, just going back to your earlier question, if this civilization, our global civilization, is based on the exploitation of fossil fuel and we don't find a suitable substitute, so there's two assumptions there, the implosion of this culture may not be followed by the rise of another global culture. We will have used up all the fossil fuel. We will have used up all the most accessible sources of resources. We will have depleted the oceans. Many species will have gone extinct. The soils will be in disarray. So if we don't manage somehow to maintain the status quo and back off enough to allow these systems to recover, our civilization may go down, not to recycle or recover in the cyclical way. In some sense, human beings are like a scorched earth species. We move through our habitat, we use everything up, and then we move on. And unfortunately, there's no place to move on. People talk about colonies on the moon or Mars, but that's an absurd fantasy. It'll never happen in the foreseeable future of any generation that I can think of. In a sense, you're saying we're going to collapse. I'm saying we have an opportunity not to, but it really does require becoming much more introspective about our state of affairs and much more intelligently analytic about the state that we're in. Most people don't think about these things because our current civilization, global capitalist society, has been very successful in providing millions of people, most of us in North America, Europe, and so on and so forth, with unprecedented levels of material well-being. But what we've done, of course, is relieved ourselves of all the negative feedback that is normally imposed on non-human species. We haven't run out of food yet, at least in this part of the world. We haven't run out of resources. But we're surviving by depleting other people's resources. We move resources all over the planet. The growth of the wealthy 20% of the world's people is at the expense of depleting resources that should be available to the other 80% of the world's people. So in some sense, globalization has blinded the populations of rich Western or Northern countries to the growing dilemma. We ran out of our own resource base. Many European countries would have collapsed long ago without access to other people's resources. So the bottom line is we've become complacent, we've become habituated to living high on the hog. We're not aware that the very doing of that is depleting assets around the planet and polluting the global commons. That's what climate change is all about. And quite frankly, I get very pessimistic sometimes and think that the only thing that will wake people up is a good swift kick in the behind by some major climate catastrophe or something of that nature that will force people to rethink this situation and realize what's really holding it together. I think our science tells us a pretty good story here about how we could solve these problems. We have the wherewithal, we have the intelligence, we have the capacity for forward planning. We have the capacity, should we choose to exercise it, to be compassionate about other people and other species. But as long as we remain complacent, we won't exercise those truly human qualities. The reality is that no population, no group of people voluntarily step off the ship. And my concern is that when the crunch comes and we're psychologically ill-prepared for it, we will see increasing tendencies toward primitive tribalism. The wall will go up around certain countries and the military will get engaged in trying to appropriate the last remaining pockets of resources for the most powerful and so on. I think if you look at the history of the United States in the past few decades, that's exactly what we're seeing, this desperate attempt of a failing empire to maintain its hegemony over the people of the planet. So that's, to my mind, the most depressing aspect of this. The evidence that there's a crunch coming is before us. We could handle it if we were to come together as a species with intelligence and foresight to solve this problem so that it doesn't result in catastrophic decline for anybody. The problem is that we tend to revert to denial and tribalism, and then as the crunch comes, global strife, warfare, and catastrophe is an equal possibility. I never want to predict the future. I think it's foolish to attempt to do so. But I think all of those scenarios are on the table and might well happen. Today's cultural story, if we have a cultural myth, it's the myth of progress, the myth that the global economy can continue to grow forever. And I think, obviously, that the bulk of biophysical science is against that myth. So we started out with what Herman Daly, a well-known ecological economist, called a relatively empty world. It was empty of human beings and our artifacts. So we've now spent a few centuries growing, but the world's now full. So the very conditions that enabled us to grow for several generations and get used to the fact that this growth could continue are changed by growth itself. So the mere scale of the very scale of the human economy now has so changed the environment in which it has evolved that it's increasingly difficult to think that we can carry on. Our cultural myth has run its course. There may have been a time when it was useful in moving things forward, but certainly if we don't change our cultural myth to conform to biophysical reality, which is the reality of limits to material growth, then we're going to have huge problems on our hands in the next few decades. People acquire their cultural narrative over the course of 20 or 30 years of simply growing up in that culture. What we're engaged in right here is a process called social learning. And to change a cultural narrative peacefully often takes decades. And you can see that in our own lifetimes. Civil liberties is a new dimension of our cultural narrative. But it took decades for civil liberties to become a respected idea. Women's liberation, gay liberation are other dimensions of our current cultural narrative that take decades before they're generally accepted. And there's still a large number of people who don't accept any of those things. So changing the cultural narrative purposefully through this kind of exchange is a very slow and arduous process. It takes decades. The problem is we don't have decades. And I think we really need to have all of our media come together in a conscious effort to bring this new story of our dilemma out there. We've got to take advantage of the full power of the internet. So the means are there to change the cultural narrative, but we're not using them. In fact, on the contrary, the opposition, as it were, those with a vested interest in the status quo, have organized in such a way as to spend tens of millions of dollars every year on a counter story, one that denies the science, undermines beliefs in climate change and most of the other kinds of trends that I'm concerned about, so that we are creating a misinformed population who are politically engaged and simply incapable of responding intelligently to the circumstances we find ourselves in. Resilience is a double-edged sword, and we really have to decide what we mean by that. So, for example, you could argue that at many times in the past, human resilience has helped bring us to this present dilemma. So when you, for example, run out of soil, you invent fertilizer. Well, we fertilize our fields and we grow more food and double the population again, and so on. So there's many aspects of resilience that actually deepen the crisis. So we need to use resilience much more creatively. And that is to say, recognize the target toward which we want to move and become resilient in doing that, rather than simply kind of unconsciously being resilient, but employing our resilience capacities to maintaining or indeed furthering the status quo. And that's historically is what has happened. We're in this mess because we're highly adaptive, we accept challenges, we develop a technology to meet them, but it simply raises the stakes, adds to the population, adds to the material pressure on the ecosystems, and in the end we reach a point where, in the Joseph Tainter story of civilizations, we'll simply be unable to cope and we'll go down. There are a number of countries that live fairly close to the current human average global, or at least what I would call the fair earth share. These societies with a different attitude could be extremely enriching. And, you know, they wouldn't be materially intense, but they'd have a strong sense of community. People would have meaningful work to do. They could have lots of fun playing and, you know, energizing each other as community in solidarity. But right now we have a situation where we tend to denigrate countries that live relatively simply with a small footprint on the planet. And it's that kind of mine is bigger than yours scenario that we're pulling off on a global scale. We really need to seek out those countries and those places that have found ways of living compatibly with their ecosystems and have a strong sense of community and capacity to survive. And of course, I can't claim that I have a full understanding. Everybody has a different interpretation of what's going on here. I think the biggest problem is that whomever you speak to seems ignorant of the basic science behind the dilemma that we're confronting. For example, we don't teach the fundamental laws of thermodynamics in our school system. And the simple fact of the matter is that to create a human being, to create a building, to create an automobile requires the destruction of vast quantities of energy and resources, and we can't have too much of that kind of thing accumulating without recognizing that because we're on a finite planet, let's face it, we're on a finite planet, we're one element or one subsystem of that planet that is growing, growing, and growing. But it's making itself out of all the other subsystems of the planet. So the larger and more resource intense the human enterprise, the less resources there are available for other species, and the more we dismantle the very systems of the ecosystemic structure and the life support functions upon which we are all dependent. So we've gone from being merely a citizen on Earth like many other species to the point where we have become a pathological parasite on the ecosystem and threaten to kill our own host.